The negotiations between Cuba and the United States took place in Canada and under a veil of secrecy that lasted all year. Pope Francis was given special acknowledgement by President Obama and President Castro for playing a role in the historic accord. So how far-reaching will these changes be? Laura Carlsen joins us now from Mexico City to discuss the implications of these negotiations. Laura, welcome to the show. Does this mean that both the United States and Cuba will attend the Summit of the Americas in Panama in April? And how will this agreement change the dynamics and the agenda at the summit?
Yes, they're both talking about attending so far, and this is one of the most important features of the new full diplomatic relationship between the United States and Cuba, because of course the absence of Cuba at the Americas summits has been a thorn in the side of the entire hemisphere. It's been a point of criticism toward the United States government and been a point of suspicion of the other countries, especially the center-left governments, toward the United States. It's isolated the United States, which of course was exactly what the United States was trying to do to Cuba. So with this coming into the fold of both the United States in a sense and of Cuba at the summit that's anticipated to have both countries present in April in Panama of next year, then we see for the first time a real America summit in which all countries are represented, and there's a possibility of leaving behind the Cold War logic that has persevered so many decades.
Well, you know, it's been noted lately that the United States has played a role of the absent neighbor in Latin America, as you mentioned. However, Obama mentioned Jose Marti in his speech and ended the speech by saying, "Todos somos Americanos" in Spanish. So should we expect a shift in the way the U.S. approaches the region?
I think that one of his intentions in taking this bold step toward diplomatic relations with Cuba after more than 5 decades was precisely to give the United States a greater role within the Americas and more legitimacy as a nation at the dialogue table, because it's still been the case that the United States is seen as throwing around its economic and military weight when it comes to diplomacy within the Americas. And with this move, it could be seen as a signal that the Obama administration and the United States government is willing to open up dialogue as equals within the hemisphere. And that signal has already been received with a great deal of satisfaction from governments throughout Latin America.
You know, some have said that oil prices are plummeting around the world and that it may have an effect in the aid that Cuba receives from Venezuela. Do you think this was a factor in the negotiation at all?
I think the economic readjustments that are taking place, both with oil prices, with the relative standing of oil countries like Venezuela and Mexico, and in general, in terms of different blocs and alliances, they all have an effect here, because one of the major intentions also of this was to bring Cuba into the global economy, in a sense. So we've seen a great loosening up of the banking rules within this broad, wide-ranging accord that President Obama and President Castro announced. And we're seeing this integration process going on that will mean that Cuba, although it retains many of its restrictions, and restrictions both from the U.S. side and from the Cuban side, will become much more integrated.
You know, in Colombia, FARC leaders announced a unilateral ceasefire just a few days ago. Considering that peace talks between the Colombian government and FARC guerrillas are taking place in Cuba, is there any coincidence at all to what happened between the United States and Cuba?
Well, I think all of these are good signs in the sense that that sharp division that is a vestige of the Cold War is beginning to melt away in many ways within the hemisphere. And this is, of course, a positive sign, because it means that the ideologues that maintain those divisions, and of course, there are some within the U.S. Congress that are screaming about this deal, especially the old-style Cuban Americans, you know, are no longer have the upper hand in these relationships. And the parallel with Colombia is that that society is ready to come to some agreements and to set aside, you know, these very, very deep animosities that existed under the Uribe government in particular, and look toward negotiation. So what this is, in all of those processes, and it isn't a coincidence that those talks are taking place in Cuba, and they will now become more kind of Americanized in a sense, is that we're looking toward dialogue rather than military solutions and entrenched conflict.
Laura, we mentioned Pope Francis's role. He's from Argentina. Do you think this deal could have been brokered had he not been from Latin America?
No, I think the role of Latin America and all this in this deal was very important, as I say, because Obama was looking not only to improve relations with Cuba, but also to improve relations with Latin America as a whole, because there have been a lot of friction, even though he began with a promise to improve those relations, and this will reduce a lot of the friction. And then we also have to recognize the role of the Pope in all this. The Pope played a role as a mediator that was really quite important, and I think that has made the whole path much easier. Of course, these negotiations went on for months in secret to avoid allowing those ideologues, the people who are most against this kind of a deal, to mobilize, and particularly to mobilize in the press, in which they have a great deal of access within the United States. And when it came out, it was a very complete deal and has really caused a lot of celebration throughout Latin America.
All right, our political analyst, Laura Carlsen, thank you so much for joining us from Mexico City.
America's Now